I did something a little unusual for this channel. I actually sat down and ran the numbers on what it would really feel like to be a millionaire in two completely different Australian cities, Sydney and Melbourne, and honestly, the results surprised me more than I expected going in. I assumed $1 million is $1 million no matter where you live, that the number on your bank statement should feel roughly the same wherever you wake up. What I found completely changed how I think about wealth, and by the end of this video, it might change how you think about it too, especially if you've ever assumed that hitting a certain net worth automatically means you've made it. Welcome back to Canadian Finance Hub with James. If you're new here, this channel is all about breaking down money and net worth in a way that actually reflects real life, not the highlight reel version you see online, not the fantasy influencer lifestyle, but the honest, lived experience of what different numbers actually mean day to day. Normally I talk about investing and building wealth here in Canada, TFSAs, RSPs, index funds, the usual foundations. But today I wanted to try something a little different, a direct comparison exercise, testing what the exact same net worth actually feels like depending on which city you live in. I picked Sydney and Melbourne specifically because they're two of the most compared cities in the world when it comes to cost of living versus lifestyle, constantly debated online, constantly ranked against each other, and I genuinely wanted to see for myself whether the assumptions most people make actually hold up once you dig into the real numbers. Let's get into it. I started with housing, because this is usually where the biggest gap in perceived wealth shows up first. In Sydney, median house prices sit well above $1.5 million, which means a millionaire there, on paper, isn't even close to owning an average home outright without significant debt attached. I ran the math assuming someone had a full $1 million in total net worth, and if a large chunk of that is tied up in property, their actual usable, liquid wealth shrinks dramatically once you subtract whatever mortgage they still owe. What surprised me here wasn't the number itself, it was how little of that $1 million was actually theirs to use freely, to invest further, or to fall back on in an emergency. A lot of that so-called wealth was just sitting quietly locked inside four walls, technically valuable, practically inaccessible. Then I ran the exact same scenario for Melbourne, and the difference was honestly bigger than I expected it to be. Median house prices there run noticeably lower than Sydney's, sometimes by a few $100,000 depending on the suburb you're looking at. That single difference meant a Melbourne millionaire was statistically far more likely to either own their home outright, or have significant equity remaining after their mortgage was accounted for. The emotional weight of that difference surprised me the most, because on paper both people have the exact same net worth listed on a spreadsheet, but one of them actually has real, spendable freedom sitting behind that number, while the other one is essentially house rich and cash poor, wealthy in theory but tight in practice. Next I looked at everyday cost of living, because I wanted to know how far that $1 million actually stretches once you're living your regular, ordinary life. Sydney consistently ranks as one of the more expensive cities in the world, and that shows up in almost everything: parking, groceries, dining out, public transport, even the small daily purchases most people don't think twice about. I found that even someone with $1 million sitting in the bank in Sydney still has to stay mentally alert about spending, not necessarily because they can't afford things, but because the city itself is quietly built to take a little more out of every single transaction. That part genuinely surprised me, because I assumed once you hit millionaire status, that kind of daily financial awareness would simply disappear. It doesn't, at least not in Sydney, and that alone reshaped how I think about what wealth actually buys you. Melbourne told a very different story once I ran the same comparison. Cafe culture, dining, and general everyday costs were noticeably more affordable across the board, and the version of wealth I found there felt more relaxed, more breathable, less calculated at every turn. A Melbourne millionaire wasn't constantly checking receipts out of anxiety. They were simply living their life, because the gap between their net worth and their actual cost of living wasn't stretched nearly as thin as it was up in Sydney. This was honestly the moment during my research where I realized that wealth isn't just about the number sitting in your account, it's about how far that number actually carries you day to day where you live, and that single insight surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire comparison. I also looked into how people in each city tend to build their wealth in the first place, because I was curious whether the paths looked different too, and this surprised me as well. Sydney, being Australia's biggest financial hub, tends to produce millionaires who lean heavily into property speculation and stock market investing, largely because the entire culture of the city is wrapped around finance and real estate at almost every level, from casual conversation to career choice. Melbourne, on the other hand, showed a noticeably different pattern in the data I found: more small business ownership, more creative industries, and more diversified income streams outside of just property speculation alone. It wasn't that one city's millionaires were somehow smarter or more disciplined than the other, it was simply that the realistic paths to that same seven-figure number looked genuinely different depending on the local economy surrounding them. Here's the part that surprised me the most out of this entire comparison, and honestly, the reason I wanted to make this video in the first place. Despite Sydney's reputation as the flashier, more prestigious, wealthier city, cost of living adjusted studies consistently suggested that the same $1 million in Melbourne often provides a genuinely higher standard of living than that exact same $1 million would in Sydney. When you factor in housing pressure, daily expenses, and the constant psychological weight of living in one of the most expensive cities in the world, Sydney's millionaires sometimes reported feeling less financially secure than you'd logically expect them to feel. That completely challenged the assumption I walked into this comparison with, that more expensive automatically means better, or that a flashier city automatically produces a more comfortable version of wealth. That said, Sydney does have one clear advantage that Melbourne genuinely can't fully match, and that's raw earning potential. As Australia's financial capital, Sydney offers the largest concentration of high-paying finance, banking, and corporate roles anywhere in the country. If the goal is climbing the income ladder as quickly and aggressively as possible, Sydney gives you significantly more opportunities to reach that first million faster, even if the cost of living quietly eats into a bigger portion of it once you actually get there. Melbourne offered a gentler, more balanced path instead, slightly lower income ceilings in certain industries, but significantly more breathing room once that wealth has actually been built and locked in. So after running this entire comparison from start to finish, which city actually wins? Honestly, it depends entirely on what kind of wealthy life you actually want for yourself. If you want speed, energy, and the biggest financial opportunities the country has to offer, and you don't mind your money working a little harder just to maintain your lifestyle around it, Sydney is probably the better fit for you. But if you want that same $1 million to feel like genuine, breathing, everyday freedom, without the constant background hum of cost pressure, Melbourne delivered a version of wealth that simply felt more comfortable day to day in almost every scenario I ran, and honestly, that was the single biggest surprise of this entire experiment for me. The bigger lesson I took away from all of this goes well beyond just these two cities. Net worth alone never tells the full story of what your actual life feels like day to day. The same exact number can represent total freedom in one place and quiet, constant financial pressure in another, which means understanding cost of living and lifestyle expenses matters just as much as the size of your investment portfolio, no matter where you happen to live, including right here in Canada, where regional cost of living gaps can be just as dramatic depending on the city you're building your own wealth in. If this comparison surprised you as much as it surprised me while researching it, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people trying to understand what real financial freedom actually looks like beyond just the number itself. Let me know in the comments which city you think you'd rather be a millionaire in, Sydney or Melbourne. I read every single one and I genuinely love to hear your take. And if you want more honest breakdowns like this one on money, net worth, and real financial freedom, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next. This has been Canadian Finance Hub with James, and I'll see you in the next video.